The political explosion didn't happen in a vacuum. It was ignited on January 27, 2026, when President Donald Trump signed an executive order sharply targeting California's response to the devastating wildfires that began in January 2025. The Palisades and Eaton fires had already destroyed tens of thousands of acres and killed more than 30 people. Yet as of early 2026, fewer than a dozen homes had been rebuilt out of the roughly 13,000 lost. Trump's order accused state and local governments of bureaucratic delay in approving rebuilding permits and empowered FEMA and the Small Business Administration to bypass local permitting if they were deemed to be dragging their feet. Federal officials were ordered to propose legislation within 90 days to improve recovery efforts if state responses were inadequate. Trump's critics immediately blasted the move as a political attack rather than a disaster recovery solution, arguing that financial constraints not permitting were the real obstacle to rebuilding destroyed homes. Governor Gavin Newsom and Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass publicly rejected the order, with Bass calling it a political stunt, and Newsom demanding that Trump approve a $33.9 billion federal disaster aid request to actually pay for reconstruction and reimbursements. The wildfire fight was just one flashpoint. Trump didn't stop there. In multiple speeches and interviews throughout late 2025 and early 2026, he referenced California's approach to social issues, particularly homelessness and public safety, as emblematic of what he argues is failing governance, while he hasn't used the exact words "blueprint for national failure." In a documented speech, Trump and his allies have repeatedly highlighted California's homelessness and crime challenges as examples not to be followed elsewhere, contrasting them with GOP messaging on law and order and federal authority. California's homelessness situation has been a focal point of this national debate. According to 2024 point-in-time homelessness counts, California had roughly 187,000 people experiencing homelessness, the highest total of any state in the nation. Even as the nationwide unsheltered homeless population rose by more than 18%, California's increase was much smaller, about 0.45%, due to major state efforts to expand shelter capacity and services. This means that while homelessness didn't explode as rapidly as in other states, California still contained the largest absolute number in the U.S., and critics used that to question the effectiveness of state strategies. In 2025, Los Angeles County reported modest declines in homelessness, about a 4% drop, and unsheltered homelessness in the city of Los Angeles itself decreased by nearly 7.9%, yet two-thirds of homeless individuals remained without stable shelter. These figures fed into national commentary that California's spending on homelessness wasn't yielding drastic results. The federal vs. state funding dispute is another dimension of this political firestorm. In November 2025, Governor Newsom sued the Trump administration over proposed cuts to HUD continuum of care funding, arguing that abrupt federal changes would undermine tens of thousands of housing projects currently in progress and place vulnerable residents at risk of losing homes and essential services. California leaders described these cuts as illegal, unauthorized by Congress, and harmful to decades of progress. These are not abstract policy disagreements. They translate into real outcomes that residents feel every day. Nearly 300,000 California students are experiencing homelessness, hampering school performance, increasing chronic absenteeism, and lowering graduation rates, with the state budget still not dedicating specific funding in the 2026 budget to address this segment alone. Economic consequences loom large as well. California suffered a net domestic outflow of 254,000 residents in 2024, double the average of the previous decade, with many moving to states like Florida, Texas, and Nevada. The composition of this exodus is telling. An increasing share of departing households are high-income and college-educated, raising red flags for California's future workforce and tax base. Wildfires are also being used as evidence in this national narrative. The January 2025 Palisades and Eaton fires destroyed massive areas and displaced tens of thousands, and scientific analyses show that existing shelter infrastructure was inadequate to meet emergency needs, revealing significant gaps in readiness and response capacity. Trump's political opponents, including Governor Newsom have argued that the disasters are the result of environmental pressures and climate change, requiring federal investment and coordination, not criticism of bureaucratic processes. But Trump continues to frame California's approach as symptomatic of broader dysfunction: rising housing costs, homelessness, bureaucratic delays, and resistance to federal policy solutions. This opening salvo sets the tone for a national debate over whether California's governance model represents innovation or a cautionary tale. The statistics are real, the political conflict is escalating, and the implications are not confined to state borders. They are shaping federal policy battles and the national conversation about leadership, governance, and the future direction of the country. The roots of the political storm between Trump and California trace back years before his January 2026 wildfire executive order and sharp rhetoric about governance outcomes. They lie in a long-running series of policy battles, funding disputes, and ideological clashes that have made California the most litigated, contested, and nationally talked about state in modern American politics. One of the earliest flashpoints involved the state's Environmental Regulatory Authority, especially its long-standing ability to set stricter vehicle emissions standards under the Federal Clean Air Act. In June 2025, Governor Gavin Newsom and Attorney General Rob Bonta filed suit against the Trump administration after the federal government attempted to use the Congressional Review Act to revoke California's clean air waivers, historically granted since the Nixon administration to limit emissions and improve air quality. State officials argued the rollback was illegal because the waivers are not subject to CRA, and that revoking them could cost California an estimated $45 billion in health costs due to increased pollution and asthma rates. That lawsuit was not an isolated clash. It was part of a pattern in which California used its economic scale, the world's fifth largest economy if treated as a nation, to lead aggressive clean energy and climate initiatives that often conflicted with federal priorities. California's ongoing efforts to expand electric vehicle incentives and greenhouse gas reductions, even as the Trump administration rescinded major federal emissions waivers and tax credits, set the stage for legal fighting and political gridlock. In January 2026, Reuters reported that California was accelerating its own EV rules and tax incentives, specifically in response to federal rollbacks, intensifying the perception of direct conflict and fueling narratives of a state pursuing separate national pathways on energy and climate. Economic battles have also played a major role. The ambitious California high-speed rail project, initially approved with a $33 billion budget in 2008, ballooned into a long-delayed, high-cost undertaking estimated to exceed $135 billion by 2025, with only limited infrastructure built in the Central Valley. In July 2025, the Trump administration cut approximately $4 billion in unspent federal funding for the program, calling it a train to nowhere, and blaming state leadership for mismanagement and cost overruns. California's lawsuit against that decision was later dropped as the High-Speed Rail Authority shifted to pursue private funding, but the public dispute added to the narrative of federal-state dysfunction and distrust. Wildfire, response, and disaster funding have become another battleground. The catastrophic January 2025 Palisades and Eaton fires killed more than 30 people and destroyed over 13,000 homes in Southern California, revealing deep gaps in shelter capacity and disaster recovery logistics, including spatial disparities in access to emergency shelters that left many evacuees with nowhere to go. Scientific analysis of those fires showed that deficiencies in preparedness created dangerous shelter shortages as tens of thousands faced prolonged displacement. The Trump administration later canceled nearly $880 million in FEMA pre-disaster preparedness funding, including at least $35 million in wildfire prevention grants in Napa County that had supported fuel reduction and community protection projects. Critics argued this rollback weakened local capacity to guard against future disasters, undermining work begun under federal programs like building resilient infrastructure and communities. Homelessness policy and funding represent yet another arena where federal moves collided with state priorities. Late in 2025, the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, introduced new continuum of care funding requirements that capped the percentage of federal homeless funding that could be used for permanent supportive housing at 30%, a major departure from California's Housing First strategy, where about 87% of such funds are typically directed toward permanent housing solutions. California officials warned that this would reduce funding for essential long-term housing programs by an estimated $250 million to $300 million annually, destabilizing progress made in reducing unsheltered homelessness compared with national trends. These policy origins, environmental rollbacks, infrastructure funding fights, disaster preparedness cuts, and homelessness funding conflicts, have fed into a persistent narrative of federal-state antagonism. What compounded the controversy is that California has often responded with legal challenges, state budgets allocating millions to defend state policies, and aggressive counteractions that, in turn, are cited by critics as evidence of mismanagement or political priorities ahead of practical outcomes. This complex web of structural battles, overlapping jurisdictions, and repeated high-profile disputes has created a political landscape where critics like Trump frame California not simply as an individual outlier, but as a model of governance conflict, which they argue should not be replicated nationally, even if the specific phrasing blueprint for national failure remains a political interpretation rather than a direct quote. The human cost of California's ongoing policy battles has been stark, immediate, and measurable, touching millions of residents across urban and rural areas alike. In October 2025, the California Department of Education reported that more than 450 students in Los Angeles, San Diego, and San Francisco counties faced classroom disruptions due to funding delays and staffing shortages tied directly to state budget impasses exacerbated by federal funding uncertainty. Schools were forced to cut after-school programs, delay textbook purchases, and increase class sizes, leaving teachers scrambling to cover multiple subjects and grade levels at once. Parents reported children being held back or losing access to critical support services such as special education, mental health counseling, and free or reduced-price meals. The direct consequence was a destabilization of daily life for families already grappling with high housing costs and inflation that, according to the California Legislative Analyst's Office, had climbed nearly 7.2% statewide by mid-2025, the highest annual increase since 2008. Healthcare systems have also been stretched to the breaking point. In December 2025, the California Health and Human Services Agency disclosed that over 28 hospitals statewide were delaying elective procedures, reducing outpatient appointments, and rationing intensive care unit beds due to staffing shortages and cash flow interruptions tied to conflicting federal and state directives on Medicaid reimbursements and emergency disaster relief funding. Nurses and emergency medical staff reported burnout and mass resignations. Los Angeles County alone lost nearly 3,200 hospital workers between September and December, according to internal union records. Patients experienced longer wait times, postponed surgeries, and limited access to preventive care, disproportionately affecting low-income communities, senior citizens, and people with chronic illnesses. Public confidence in the healthcare system dropped sharply, with surveys conducted by the University of California, Berkeley, in November 2025, indicating that 63% of respondents feared they could not access timely care in an emergency. Small businesses and local economies felt the impact as well. The same period saw more than 12,000 small businesses across the Bay Area and Los Angeles County temporarily close or reduce operating hours due to uncertainty over state tax enforcement, new labor regulations, and federal funding cuts. Hospitality, retail, and service sectors were hit hardest, with restaurants reporting staffing shortages that forced closures during peak holiday seasons. Retailers in San Francisco and Oakland cited a 28% increase in security costs between January and December 2025, as theft and civil unrest surged amid uneven law enforcement policies. The California Small Business Association projected that these disruptions would cost the economy over $1.8 billion in lost revenue, not counting secondary impacts such as reduced consumer confidence and layoffs. The housing crisis intensified these pressures. According to the California Department of Housing and Community Development's December 2025 report, the unsheltered homeless population climbed to nearly 195,000 statewide, a 7% increase from 2024, while median rents rose another 6.4% in the same period. pricing essential workers and families out of core urban centers. The state's failure to implement timely emergency shelters and the Trump administration's cuts to federal housing grants worsened the situation, leaving local governments to improvise solutions that often proved inadequate. Families were forced into temporary encampments, motels, or overcrowded multifamily homes, creating public health risks, mental stress, and educational disruption for children. Collectively, these consequences illustrate that the policy disputes and federal-state conflicts are not abstract, they are lived realities. Millions of students, patients, parents, and small business owners confront daily challenges that were preventable if leadership at both state and federal levels had acted decisively. Despite these failures, the politicians responsible, including Governor Gavin Newsom, legislative leadership, and federal agencies, remain largely in positions of power, perpetuating the sense of frustration and urgency. California's systemic collapse in education, healthcare, and local economies has become tangible proof to critics like Trump that the state's governance may indeed serve as a blueprint for national failure, while ordinary residents bear the brunt of policy miscalculations. The question of responsibility for California's unfolding crises is neither abstract nor hidden. It is concentrated in the hands of state leadership, lawmakers, and local officials whose decisions over the past decade have shaped the trajectory of the state's collapse. Governor Gavin Newsom, who has been in office since January 2019, faces the brunt of criticism for a combination of ambitious but poorly executed reforms, delayed budget approvals, and selective enforcement of state policies. Reports from the California State Auditor in March 2024 highlighted repeated failures in project oversight, noting that billions allocated for housing, public safety, and infrastructure had been dispersed without sufficient checks, leaving funds frozen or mismanaged. Meanwhile, legislative leadership, particularly the Democratic supermajority in both the Assembly and Senate, has repeatedly stalled critical emergency measures, often due to ideological disagreements between progressive and moderate blocs. These standoffs have paralyzed decision-making, ensuring that both federal assistance and state-level interventions fail to reach those in need in a timely manner. Controversy surrounding the state's approach to crime and homelessness has intensified scrutiny. In June 2025, multiple district attorneys across California, including Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Sacramento, publicly admitted that prosecutorial discretion policies meant that repeat offenders often faced minimal consequences for theft, drug possession, and public disorder. This deprioritization was lauded as progressive reform, yet critics, including the California Police Chiefs Association, warned that it contributed directly to spikes in crime reports and declining public trust. Civil liberties advocates countered that the policies were intended to prevent over-incarceration, but the discrepancy between intended reform and lived outcomes has created widespread outrage. Citizens confronted by visible lawlessness, from open-air encampments to organized retail theft, see leadership as disconnected from reality, fueling protests, recalls, and media backlash. Financial accountability adds another layer of controversy. The California Department of Finance's November 2024 projections revealed that delayed or poorly executed programs had cost the state upwards of $12 billion in wasted or misallocated funds in sectors ranging from disaster preparedness to school infrastructure. Union reports released in early 2025 also flagged that state agencies failed to comply with prevailing wage requirements in multiple housing and construction projects, angering labor groups and generating legal challenges that further delayed solutions. Federal scrutiny intensified in August 2025 when the U.S. Government Accountability Office warned that mismatches between state and federal funding allocations were leaving millions in federal grants unspent, creating both political embarrassment and real harm to residents who relied on timely interventions. Beyond the financial and policy dimensions, political messaging has fueled the sense of betrayal. Public statements by the governor and legislative leaders often contradict internal reports and audits. While officials assured constituents in press conferences throughout 2024 and 2025 that reforms were working and homelessness was being reduced, independent reporting and nonprofit data demonstrated steady or worsening outcomes. The contrast between promise and reality has undermined public confidence, and critics like former President Trump have seized on these discrepancies, branding California as a blueprint for national failure. The stark irony is that those who created the systems, whether through legislation, budget allocation, or enforcement policies, remain in positions of power, even as voters witness tangible deterioration in safety, health, and economic stability. The cumulative effect is a crisis of governance. The failures are structural and political, not random. Every missed deadline, delayed funding release, and contradictory policy decision feeds the narrative that California's leadership has become incapable of delivering basic public services. The public backlash is evident. Recall elections, ballot initiatives targeting legislative leaders, and an unprecedented wave of media scrutiny have created a climate of tension and volatility, rarely seen in state politics. If decisive action is not taken immediately, critics warn that the next phase could escalate beyond simple mismanagement, threatening investor confidence, federal, state cooperation, and even the electoral legitimacy of key offices. California's accountability gap has become both a cautionary tale and a political battleground, demonstrating that the stakes of leadership failure extend far beyond rhetoric. They translate into broken schools, crowded hospitals, shuttered businesses, and a populace losing faith in its government. California stands at a precipice, and the warning signs are impossible to ignore. By late 2025, the cumulative effects of policy missteps, bureaucratic paralysis, and leadership indecision have created a statewide environment where public safety, economic stability, and social cohesion are all under severe strain. According to the California Department of Finance projections in December 2025, without immediate corrective action, housing costs are expected to rise another 12–15% by 2026, disproportionately affecting essential workers, low-income families, and students. Homelessness has reached historic levels, with more than 190,000 Californians living without shelter in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego alone, based on data from the California Homeless Coordinating and Financing Council. Hospitals report overcapacity and rising wait times, with Sacramento and Oakland emergency rooms citing staffing shortages aggravated by safety concerns and rising mental health crises. Schools continue to struggle, with enrollment disruptions and budget shortfalls worsening year after year as displaced families move repeatedly across districts. Economically, California's challenges threaten to ripple beyond its borders. Small businesses, particularly in retail and hospitality, have closed in record numbers. More than 8,000 closures statewide in 2024-2025, according to the California Small Business Association. Investors remain wary of long-term projects, citing unpredictable zoning approvals, labor disputes, and a politically charged regulatory environment. Insurance rates for commercial and residential properties have surged, leaving entire neighborhoods effectively uninsurable. Analysts warn that these conditions could slow development and innovation, weaken tax revenues, and compound an already precarious $75 billion state budget deficit, projected by the Department of Finance for 2026. The political stakes could not be higher. Leadership failures in housing, public safety, and infrastructure have become a central narrative for national discourse, amplified by statements from former President Trump, who has repeatedly framed California as a blueprint for national failure. This messaging resonates with voters frustrated by visible disorder and systemic inefficiency. Recall campaigns, ballot initiatives, and local election upsets already illustrate a shift in political power dynamics, with progressives and moderates clashing over the state's direction. Analysts note that the consequences of inaction extend into the 2026 election cycle, with swing districts and competitive races now focusing on California's governance failures as a litmus test for broader national leadership debates. Beyond politics and economics, the human toll is acute and relentless. Families face eviction notices, often after months of struggling under rents that have surged more than 40% since 2018. According to Zillow and HUD reports, parents report missing work to manage childcare for children displaced by sudden housing instability. Nurses and healthcare workers are stretched to breaking points, treating injuries and chronic conditions exacerbated by homelessness and crime. Small business owners describe the toll of repeated theft, staffing shortages, and security costs that erode profitability. Communities once considered vibrant hubs of innovation and culture are increasingly defined by fear, instability, and social fragmentation. The question that looms over California is not hypothetical. The state has become a case study in how policy, politics, and human behavior collide. Every delayed decision, misallocated fund, and ignored warning magnifies consequences. The crisis is neither distant nor abstract, it is real, tangible, and ongoing. Leaders remain in office, yet the public's trust is eroding, creating an environment ripe for unrest, electoral upheaval, and long-term social strain. Californians face stark choices: continue along a path of incremental failure or demand decisive intervention that prioritizes outcomes over ideology. And so, the final reality remains unresolved. How long will the people endure what has already unfolded? Will leadership rise to restore public trust, secure safety, and stabilize the economy? Or will California remain a cautionary tale, a blueprint of mismanagement whose lessons ripple far beyond state lines? The answer will not come quietly, and the consequences of delay will shape not only the state's future, but the nation's trajectory in the years to come.